The Potter's Quiet Wheel, a rhythmic story of centering and rest. The first snowflakes had been gentle, almost apologetic, drifting past the kitchen window while Elena finished her morning coffee. By noon, the meteorologists were using words like historic and blizzard conditions and advising everyone to stay home. By 2 o'clock, the world outside had become a wall of white, and Elena was lacing up her boots. Her studio was only 3 blocks away, a converted garage behind an old Victorian that had been split into apartments. The landlord had been happy to rent it cheap to someone who would actually use it, who would keep the heat on and the pipes from freezing. Elena had lined the walls with salvaged shelves, installed better lighting, and brought in her wheel. It had become more than a workspace. In the past 6 months, as her life had seemed to unravel in slow motion, the studio had become the only place where things made sense. The walk through the snow was harder than she'd expected. The wind pushed against her with surprising strength, and by the time she reached the studio door, her cheeks were burning with cold. She fumbled with the key, finally got the door open, and stumbled inside, bringing a small flurry of snow with her. The studio was dark and cold, but it was shelter. She flipped the light switch, and the warm glow of the overhead lamp spread across the space. The potter's wheel sat in the center like an altar, patient and waiting. Bags of clay were stacked against the wall. Finished pieces lined the shelves, bowls and mugs and vases in various stages of drying. The air smelled of earth and something mineral, something ancient. Elena shrugged off her coat and cranked up the small space heater in the corner. As warmth began to seep into the room, she felt her shoulders drop, tension she hadn't known she was carrying beginning to release. Outside, the wind howled and threw snow against the windows, but inside there was only this, her space, her tools, her hands. She'd been avoiding the wheel for weeks. There had been excuses, work deadlines, social obligations, a relationship that had slowly burned itself out in a series of small disappointments and silences. She'd been busy, she'd told herself. Too busy to make the time for clay, for the slow and deliberate work of shaping something with her hands. But the truth, which she could admit here in the quiet, was that she'd been afraid. Afraid that if she stopped moving, stopped filling every hour with noise and obligation, she would have to face how scattered she felt, how far from herself she'd drifted. A small sound made her turn. On the highest shelf, barely visible among the biscuitware, a pair of golden eyes blinked at her. "Smudge," Elena said softly, "I didn't know you were here." The kitten belonged to Mrs. Chung upstairs, but Smudge had adopted the studio as her second home, slipping in through a gap in the back door that Elena had never quite gotten around to fixing. She was a tiny thing, all charcoal gray fluff with oversized ears and a perpetually surprised expression. Now she stretched, arching her back in that exaggerated way kittens do, and chirped a greeting. "Just you and me tonight," Elena said. "Storm of the century out there." Smudge's eyes tracked her as she moved to the clay storage, and Elena felt oddly grateful for the company. She selected a 25-pound bag of stoneware, hefted it onto the work table, and cut the plastic with her wire tool. The clay inside was cool and slightly damp, wrapped in layers of plastic to keep it from drying out. She cut off a substantial chunk, maybe 5 pounds, and the rest she wrapped carefully and returned to the bag. This piece she carried to the wedging table, a thick plaster slab set at hip height. Wedging was the first step, the necessary step. You had to work the clay before you could shape it, had to press out any air bubbles that might cause the piece to explode in the kiln. But it was more than that. Wedging was meditative, rhythmic. It demanded your full attention and gave you something in return: presence. Elena pressed her palms into the clay and began to rock it forward, fold it over, rock it forward again. The motion was like kneading bread, a push and turn, push and turn. Her shoulders took up the rhythm. The clay was cool against her hands, dense and yielding at once. Push and turn, push and turn. She thought about the past few months, the way everything had seemed to happen at once. The project at work that had fallen through despite months of preparation. The argument with her sister that had left them not speaking. The relationship with Marcus that had ended not with a bang but with a long, tired sigh. Both of them finally admitting that they'd been holding on to something that had stopped growing a long time ago. Push and turn, push and turn. Each disappointment had felt manageable on its own, but together they'd accumulated like snow, each flake insignificant until suddenly you couldn't see the ground anymore. The clay was warming in her hands, becoming more pliable. She checked it for air pockets, pressing and listening for any hollow spots. When she was satisfied, she shaped it into a rough ball and carried it to the wheel. Smudge had crept down from her perch and now sat on the edge of the work table, tail curled neatly around her paws, watching with intense focus. "You're in for a show," Elena told her. She dipped her hands in the water bucket, feeling the shock of cold, and settled onto the wheel's seat. The stool was old, worn smooth by years of use by whoever had owned the wheel before her. She'd bought it secondhand from a ceramics teacher who was retiring, and sometimes she imagined all the hands that had shaped clay here, all the quiet hours of work and concentration. The wheel was electric, a workhorse model with a foot pedal that controlled the speed. Elena positioned the clay ball in the center, or what she thought was the center, and hit the pedal. The wheel spun to life with its familiar hum, a sound she felt in her bones. But the clay immediately began to wobble, lurching to one side with each rotation, not centered, not even close. She stopped the wheel, repositioned the clay, tried again. Same result. The centrifugal force pulled the clay outward, and even though she pressed her hands against it, trying to force it into alignment, it resisted, bulging and warping. This was the hardest part for beginners, the part where most people gave up. Centering looked simple when you watched someone experienced do it. The clay rose into a perfect cone, smooth and symmetrical, spinning like it was always meant to spin that way. But the reality was different. The reality was that clay, like everything else, resisted being controlled. Elena stopped the wheel again, took a breath. Her hands were already coated in slip, the liquid mixture of clay and water that made everything slippery and smooth. She could hear the wind outside, a low moan punctuated by sharper gusts that rattled the windows. But here, under the lamp's warm light, with her hands on the clay and Smudge watching from her perch, there was only this, the next attempt. She started the wheel slowly this time, giving herself a chance to feel the clay's movement. With both hands, she braced the wobbling mass, palms firm against opposite sides. The trick was pressure without tension. You had to be strong but not rigid, had to push while also allowing the clay to move. It was a conversation, not a command. The clay fought her. It bulged to the left, and she corrected. It lurched to the right, and she adjusted. Her forearms began to ache from the sustained pressure. Water and slip ran down to her elbows, dripping onto her jeans. And then, for just a moment, she felt it. The wobble decreased. The clay spun more smoothly under her palms, but she shifted her weight wrong, lost the alignment of her hands, and the clay immediately went off center again. "Damn," she muttered. Smudge chirped as if in agreement. Elena smiled despite herself. She stopped the wheel, added more water, and began again. This time, she thought about what her first ceramics teacher had told her years ago in a community college class she'd taken on a whim. "The clay will teach you," he'd said. "It will teach you patience. It will teach you presence. It will teach you that the only way to move forward is to be exactly where you are." At the time, she'd thought it was just pottery mysticism, the kind of thing teachers said to sound profound. But now, with her hands shaking slightly from effort and her clay stubbornly off-kilter, she understood. She'd been trying to force everything lately, trying to force the failed project to somehow work anyway, trying to force her relationship with Marcus into something it wasn't, trying to force herself to feel okay when she didn't. And just like the clay, everything had resisted, had wobbled and warped under the pressure. She took a slow breath and started the wheel again. This time she didn't try to force anything. She simply placed her hands on the clay left hand on the outside, right hand bracing from the inside, and applied steady, gentle pressure. She let her body rock slightly with the wheel's motion, finding the rhythm instead of imposing it. The clay began to respond. The wobble decreased, then decreased again. She added a little more pressure, bringing her hands closer together, compressing the clay inward and upward. The mass began to rise into a cone, not perfect yet, but better. Better. She could feel it in her palms now, the way the clay was starting to spin true. The friction generated heat. The slip between her hands and the clay created a strange, intimate sensation, wet and smooth and just slightly resistant. Up and down. Cone up, flatten down. Cone up, flatten down. This was the centering motion, the way you coaxed the clay into perfect alignment. With each cycle, the wobble decreased further. And then, suddenly it was there. The clay was centered. It spun under her hands like it was floating, no resistance, no wobble. Just a perfect cylinder of wet earth, turning in absolute symmetry. Elena felt something in her chest release. A knot she hadn't known was there coming undone. Smudge, who had been watching the wheel with the intensity of a predator stalking prey, suddenly crept closer. Her eyes were locked on the spinning clay, pupils dilated to black pools. She crouched at the edge of the work table, her little haunches wiggling as she prepared to pounce. "Don't you dare," Elena said, but she was smiling. The kitten launched herself forward, one tiny gray paw swiping at the spinning clay. Her paw connected with the slip, sending droplets flying, and when she pulled back, her nose was smudged with wet clay. She sat back, startled, and sneezed twice. Elena laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. Smudge looked offended, her clay-streaked nose giving her the appearance of a tiny, disgruntled chimney sweep. "Serves you right," Elena said, still grinning. "That's what you get for interrupting art." Smudge sneezed again, shook her head, and retreated to a safe distance, settling on a clean towel to contemplate her defeat. Elena turned back to the wheel, and her smile faded into something quieter, something more profound. The clay was still centered, still spinning true. She pressed her thumbs into the exact center of the clay, creating a small depression, and then began to press downward. This was called opening the form. You pressed your thumbs or fingers down into the centered clay, creating a well, a space where there had been none. You had to go slowly, had to feel for the bottom, leaving about half an inch of clay for the base. Press too far, and you'd go right through. Stop too soon, and the piece would be bottom-heavy and unstable. Elena pressed down slowly, steadily, feeling the cool clay part around her thumbs. Water pooled in the depression as it deepened. She could feel the wheel's rotation in her thumbs, a strange sensation like being connected to the Earth's own spin. Creating this emptiness, this space, felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. For months, she'd been filling every moment, packing her schedule, avoiding silence. But here she was creating space deliberately. She was making room. The well deepened until she felt the base beneath her thumbs, the point where she needed to stop. She pulled her thumbs outward slightly, widening the opening, then lifted them free. The wheel spun on, and now the clay was a shallow cylinder with a hollow center, the beginning of a bowl. She dipped her hands in the water again, coating them fresh with slip. The next step was to pull, the process of drawing the walls upward and outward, establishing the bowl's form. This was where the magic happened, where a lump of clay became a vessel. Elena positioned her right hand inside the cylinder, left hand outside, and brought them together until she could feel the thickness of the wall between them. Maybe an inch thick now, maybe a little more. She would thin it as she pulled. She started at the base where wall met floor and began to pull upward. Slowly, so slowly. The clay stretched between her hands, thinning as it rose. She could feel every millimeter of the movement, the way the spinning clay wanted to move, the way her hands guided it without forcing it. The sound changed. The wheel's hum was joined by a new sound, a soft friction, almost like a whisper, as the clay moved between her palms. Pull. Pause. Add water. Pull again. With each pass, the walls grew taller and thinner. The bowl began to take shape, its form emerging from her hands as if it had been waiting there all along, waiting to be revealed. Elena fell into the rhythm completely. There was no thought now, no narrative in her head, no worrying about work or relationships, or whether she was living her life correctly. There was only this, hands and clay and water and wheel, the steady hum, the wet slip, the slight resistance that meant she was working at the edge of what the clay could do. Outside, the blizzard raged on. She could hear it, the winds howl, the tick of snow against glass, but it was distant, another world. Here, in this circle of lamplight, she was at the center. She was the still point around which everything else spun. Her hands moved in their slow upward pull, and she thought about how growth happened. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small increments. Each pull added maybe a quarter inch to the height, maybe less. But pull by pull, the form emerged. How many times had she expected herself to change overnight? To wake up one morning suddenly healed from disappointment, suddenly certain about her path, suddenly whole. But that wasn't how anything worked. Change happened like this, slowly, with intention, with the same motion repeated until muscle memory took over, and you didn't have to think anymore. You just did. The bowl was taking shape now, its walls curving gently outward. She could feel it in her hands, the way the clay wanted to move, the form it was trying to become. Her job was just to listen, to guide without controlling. She made another pass, pulling from base to rim, thinning the wall further. The clay was warm now from the friction, almost the same temperature as her hands. It felt alive under her palms, responsive. Smudge had crept closer again, her earlier indignity apparently forgotten. She sat just beyond the splash zone, watching the wheel with renewed fascination. The clay smudge on her nose had dried to a lighter gray, making her look like she'd been investigating chimneys. Elena was working on what would be her final pull. The walls were thin now, maybe a quarter inch, and she could feel that pushing them further would risk collapse when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was just a small vibration, easily ignored, but the sensation broke her concentration for a fraction of a second. Her hands shifted, lost their alignment by the smallest degree. The bowl, which had been spinning perfectly, suddenly developed a wobble. The rim, which had been level, became uneven, and then, as if in slow motion, the whole form began to warp. The walls, so carefully thinned and raised, buckled. The bowl folded in on itself, collapsing into a misshapen lump. Elena's hands jerked back instinctively, but it was too late. The bowl was gone, destroyed, returned to formless clay in the space of 3 seconds. She stopped the wheel. In the sudden silence, the wheel's hum gone, just the wind outside and her own breathing, she stared at the collapsed clay. Her first instinct was familiar, the hot rush of frustration, the internal voice that immediately started cataloging failure. 40 minutes of work gone. She'd messed up, lost focus, ruined it. But then something unexpected happened. She laughed. It started as a small sound, almost a hiccup, and then grew into real laughter. She looked at the collapsed clay, then at Smudge, who was staring at the wreckage with enormous eyes, as if she couldn't believe the wheel had eaten the bowl. "Well," Elena said aloud, "that's that." The clay sat there, still perfectly usable. It hadn't gone anywhere. It was the same 5 pounds she'd started with, the same material. It didn't care that it had been a bowl for 40 minutes. It had no memory of its previous shape. It was just clay, ready to be formed again. Elena reached out and touched it, felt its warmth, and she understood, with a clarity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought, that nothing was wasted. Not the work, not the time, not the effort. The clay was still good. She was still here. The wheel still worked. She could begin again, this time as she formed the clay back into a ball and began to wedge it again on the wheel head, working it back toward center. Everything felt different. There was no anxiety, no pressure to get it perfect. She'd already failed once tonight, and the world hadn't ended. The studio was still warm. Smudge was still keeping her company, now studiously cleaning the dried clay from her nose with her paw. The blizzard was still howling outside, and she was still here, at the center, hands in the clay. The centering went faster this time. Her hands remembered what to do, and the clay, already worked, was more pliable. Within minutes, she had it spinning true again. She opened the form, pressed her thumbs down to create the well. She began the pull, bringing the walls up slowly, watching the bowl emerge again from the shapeless lump. But this time she wasn't thinking about the collapsed bowl. She wasn't thinking about Marcus or her sister or the failed project at work. She was just here, hands in the clay, feeling the spin of the wheel, listening to the friction and the hum. The bowl rose between her hands, and this one felt different. Better somehow. The walls were more even, the curve more graceful. She made each pull with confidence, trusting her hands, trusting the clay. With her last pull, she refined the rim using a damp chamois to smooth the edge. Then she took her wooden rib, a smooth, curved tool, and compressed the outside wall, smoothing any irregularities, strengthening the form. Finally, she slowed the wheel to a stop. The bowl sat before her, still on the wheel head, complete. It was simple, maybe 7 inches across and 4 inches tall. The walls curved outward gently, like cupped hands. The rim was slightly uneven. She could see that now in stillness, but it wasn't a flaw. It was character. It was the mark of being made by human hands in a particular moment, on a particular night. Elena sat back, her hands dripping with slip, and simply looked at what she'd made. Her back ached slightly from hunching over the wheel. Her jeans were soaked. Her hands would smell like clay for the next 2 days, no matter how much she washed them. And she felt more at peace than she had in months. Outside, the blizzard continued, but she realized she hadn't really heard it for the past hour. The world could be chaos, storms, and disappointments, and plans that fell apart. But here, she'd found the center. Not because the center was a place where nothing bad happened, but because the center was a place she could return to, again and again, whenever she needed to. She used a wire tool to cut the bowl free from the wheel head, sliding the thin wire under the base, and carefully lifted the bowl onto a waiting board. It would dry slowly over the next week, and then she'd fire it and glaze it and fire it again. The process was long, required patience. But she had time. She had all the time in the world. Smudge, apparently deciding that the wheel was finally safe to approach, now that it had stopped spinning, hopped up onto the work table and sniffed delicately at the finished bowl. She looked at Elena, looked at the bowl, and then settled down beside it, curling into a tiny ball of gray fluff. "Good call," Elena said softly. "I think we're done for tonight." She cleaned up slowly, enjoying the ritual of it. She sponged down the wheel head, removing all traces of slip. She cleaned her tools and returned them to their places. She wedged the remaining clay back into a smooth ball and wrapped it carefully in plastic to keep it from drying out. As she worked, she thought about her teacher's words from years ago. "The clay will teach you." And it had. It had taught her that being off-center wasn't a permanent condition. It had taught her that collapse wasn't failure, it was just an invitation to begin again. It had taught her that the only way to create something was to be fully present, hands in the clay, mind quiet, trusting the process. She'd been so far from herself these past months, spinning out of control, wobbling under the pressure of expectations and disappointments. But here, in the storm, she'd found her way back, not to some perfect version of herself, but to this, her hands, her breath, her ability to start again. Eleni turned off the wheel, and the studio fell into deeper quiet, just the hum of the space heater and the wind outside. She pulled on her coat, took one last look at the bowl drying on its board, and smiled. "Good night, Smudge," she said. The kitten, already asleep, didn't stir. Elena turned off the lamp, plunging the studio into darkness, except for the glow of the space heater. Tomorrow, she would come back. She would turn the bowl on the wheel to trim its foot, refining its final shape. And then she would start another one, and another, not because she needed to be productive, not because she was running from anything, but because this was how you built a life, one piece at a time, hands in the clay, returning again and again to your center. She stepped out into the blizzard. The snow was still falling, thick and fast, and the wind pushed against her, as she locked the studio door, but she didn't mind. She'd found what she came for. The world could spin as wildly as it wanted. She knew how to find the center now, and she knew with the certainty that came from her hands and not her head that she could always begin again. The clay was still good, and tomorrow the wheel would be waiting. If this story brought you peace tonight, please consider leaving a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet moments and restful journeys into sleep. Rest well, friends. The center is always there, waiting for you to return.